Thank you all for coming. Welcome to this first session of the reading group on Catherine Malabou's Destructive Plasticity. As you probably have already realized from the calendar, in fact, destructive plasticity, strictly speaking, will only come slightly later, namely in the second half of the seminar series, around weeks 4, 5, or 6. Before then, it's kind of extensive introduction on Catherine Malabou's philosophy in general will have to be done. And for these sessions, the idea is to divide each of them in two. In each session, we will have a first half in which I will give some kind of general overview of the topic at issue in a certain week. And then the second half hour of each session will be mostly devoted to questions, discussion, and so on and so forth. For today, the idea is to deal, again, not yet with destructive plasticity, but with an overview of Catherine Malabou's most famous concept, the concept that she's most famous for, namely plasticity. And it's true that, especially in recent times, her works is famous mostly for the engagements of Catherine Malabou with things like the neurosciences, neurobiology, epigenetics, feminism, and so on and so forth. Today, however, we will deal mostly with the very beginning, with the very earliest phase of Malabou's philosophy, namely her groundbreaking interpretation of Hegel, which she delivered already for her PhD thesis. Her PhD supervisor, by the way, was none other than Jacques Derrida. The PhD thesis eventually became a book, The Future of Hegel, which launched almost immediately in the worldwide philosophical landscape of the time, with an interpretation of Hegel that is at the same time very original and very orthodox, in fact. So for the most of it relies very closely on the orthodox interpretations of Hegel that people like Bernard Bourgeois, for instance, have given. And yeah, so the idea for today, at least, would be to get back to this earliest and perhaps right now slightly overlooked phase of her philosophical career, because quite undisputably the later phases of Malabou's philosophical production all derive from this initial gesture, like from this initial interpretation of Hegel's system, according to an original framework, which is that of plasticity. So she was the very first one to think of Hegel in that way. What she did essentially was to notice that the word plasticity and the concept plasticity recurred not too often, but still quite a few times in quite key junctures of Hegel's philosophy. And so she elaborated on these recurrences, on these times in which the concept and the word of plasticity would turn up in Hegel's system. She would then proceed to kind of turn Hegelian system on its head. Namely, she would make plasticity not some kind of marginal reference within Hegel's philosophical books, but rather the very center, the very kind of unacknowledged hidden center of Hegel's system. And indeed, this new interpretation with plasticity at the center ultimately looked very much like the original thing. So again, the one of the things that make this interpretation interesting is that it's at the same time very original and very orthodox. It's not a very long stretch far away from traditional interpretations of Hegel, although plasticity is for the first time acknowledged at the very center of it. Plasticity is usually defined by Malabou herself as the coincidence of three things, three aspects: giving form, taking form, and destroying form. Now, the destroying form is something that which is of course the core of destructive plasticity, is something that we will see in greater detail probably only in the next weeks. So today probably we will focus more on the giving and taking of form, although in a couple of instances, the destruction of form will also turn up, as we will see. And perhaps the quickest, the shortest way to define it and to locate it in Hegel's philosophical system would be by minding the very traditional, and one would also say commonsensical definition of traditional Hegelian idealism, namely everything is in the subject. Now, of course, I'm simplifying a lot, but this kind of simplified definition is already useful in order to understand what she and possibly Hegel mean with plasticity. Everything is in the subject means that everything bears the imprint of subjectivity. We all know that it's a very traditional take on Hegel. Now, what Malabou adds is that we need to think of subjectivity in terms of form, and we need to think of form in terms of subjectivity. So the point of plasticity is very much this equation between subjectivity and form. Everything has a form, and this form comes to the fore by a double process or a threefold process of giving form and taking form and destroying form, as we will eventually see as well. So form is formed by way of giving form and taking form all at once. Of course, there are many Hegelian technical intricacies that Malabou goes through in her book, The Future of Hegel. And all of this was rather admirably summarized also in the short excerpt of an essay, which was among the two readings for this week. So we won't go into these intricacies a lot today, but there is at least one technical Hegelian thing that needs to be mentioned, one or two perhaps, but one for sure. And this one thing is what Hegel calls the substance subject, substance slash subject. Substance is, again, I'm simplifying somewhat, but we can take substance to mean something like the one, the universal. The universal in a sense that is very close to philosophical presence, as in the coincidence of something with itself, or more precisely, coincidence of something with its own concept. So it's like something like the universal as presence and the presence as universal. And he takes this mainly from Spinoza, by the way, although he, as in Hegel, would also claim that Spinoza doesn't go as far as he should have in uh, pinning down and defining the immanence of the substance. And the key point is that in order for substance to be universal, it has to be one, but also not one. Namely, it has to be one, but it also has to be divided, self-divided. Weren't it self-divided, it wouldn't be universal. Again, I'm simplifying somewhat, but I think this can be pretty much said to be the point. Subject is what makes substance what it is, from within, as it were. The definition of subject and substance is very close in Hegel, it's very similar. And again, subject is what makes the substance to be both united and self-divided, is what makes substance universal, because it is that which makes substance at the same time itself as one and itself as self-divided. Now, what does self-divided mean? It means that substance, in order to be itself, it has to alienate itself into its accidents being, simply put, the features, the characteristics of substance or essence. And so the whole point of substance subject and the whole point of plasticity more generally, is that this process of substance going into the manifold accidents that define and determine what substance is a twofold and reciprocal process, in the sense that the reciprocity of this process is really the key of plasticity in general. Namely, that as much as the various accidents derive from substance, substance too derives from the accidents that it is supposed to give birth to. So in this speculative unity between these two contrary process lies what plasticity is. Substance gives form to these accidents, but takes forms from them as well. And this reciprocity is essentially what plasticity is. It is what Malabou and Hegel call the passage from the predicative position to the speculative position. The predicative position is the one in which you have accidents as a result of substance, as something that kind of vertically derives from substance. But then the opposite process is also the case. And this coincidence between both these derivations that go in opposite ways is essentially what plasticity is, what plasticity is about. And one can think of it, for instance, in terms of, like in very traditional terms of, for instance, body and spirit. So we can think of substance as the kind of universal spirit that is that gets into the bodies, that is infused in the bodies, but we wouldn't have a grasp of what that universal intangible spirit actually is without taking into account the concrete dimension of the bodies as well. So it's this twofoldness that is at stake, or uh, some kind of abstract concept, not necessarily in the specific Hegelian way, but just in general terms of an abstract concept that is supposed to shape a certain matter, um, is also determined in turn and conversely by the materiality that it gives shape to. So it's this double movement of giving shape and receiving shape that essentially defines plasticity. There's another very beautiful essay in French by Catherine Malabou. I don't know. I don't think that it's been translated into English. It's the opening essay of La Chambre du Milieu, this one book here, in which she compares this process to electricity, pointing out that, in fact, electricity was invented precisely in the years in which Hegel would elaborate his philosophical system. So you have this kind of polarity that goes constantly from one. You have the circulation that unceasingly goes from one pole of the one pole to the other, and the other way around, of two polar opposites. And this is what plasticity is about, and this is what the dialectics essentially is about for Malabou. Plasticity is kind of the truth of the dialectic, the not so hidden truth of the dialectical process. And so yeah, substance then self-determines thanks to the subject that enables this self-alienation into the accidents and the other way around. And this is what defines essentially plasticity. Now, the other key aspect that must be taken into account in all of this is that plasticity is not at all some kind of transcendental principle. And this is also something that was in the readings for today at multiple times. Plasticity is not some kind of transcendental scheme or some transcendental framework for essentially two reasons. One is that it's simply not subtracted to experience, and it's not subtracted to representation. It's there. So plasticity can only come in form that can be sensed and represented. There's no such a thing as an transcendental form informing the form, but form also comes only and always comes in definite shapes. And second and most important aspect, plasticity is historical. Namely, plasticity changes. And if it changes with time, obviously it cannot be transcendental in the strict sense. And indeed, most of, or at least half of the first readings for this week was about clarifying why plasticity is historical. And Malabou does that by going over the two, as it were, macro phases that plasticity knew. Each of these two macro phases corresponds to a different kind of plasticity. And each of these two different kinds of plasticity is a different way to articulate together substance and subject essence and accident, or necessity and contingencies, and all this kind of binaries. And the two historical macrophases that also happen to be the ones that Hegel focuses on, the classical Greek era, so the plasticity in the classical Greek sense, and plasticity in a modern Christian sense. Each of these two consider plasticity in a different way. In the classical Greek era, plasticity was considered in one might say expressive terms, in the sense that the subject was an expression of substance. Substance is the infinite one that takes a definite, finite form thanks to the subject. So what happens, in the words of Malabou, is something like a substantialization of accidents, which means accidents are polished, like in the literal sense of what is accidental, is polished away until what remains is the essential, the essence, and thus the substance, in an immediately sensible form. The key example to this is statues. Of course, statues is like perhaps the key thing of Greek art. And what Greek statues are is an expression of the spirit, so an expression of the infinite spirituality into finite, harmonious forms. The accident of the sensible is polished away until what remains of the sensible is what immediately expresses the underlying essence. So this is the time, this is the era of what Malabou calls exemplary individualities, plastic individualities. And Hegel too mentions subjects, individuals like Socrates, Pericles, and so on and so forth, as individuals which are some kind of individual embodiment, an embodiment as individual of the one universal substance. Things change in the other conception of plasticity that Malabou focuses on, namely modern Christian plasticity. It's the flip side of what I already mentioned when I mentioned the substance/subject, namely substance, in order to be truly universal, has to be as well self-divided, not just one, but also not one. And the modern era is the phase in which substance is not one, is like self-divided. In modern era, God is the God that dies on the cross. And hence we have not substantialization of accidents, but the accidentalization of substance, according again to Malabou, namely God that becomes an accident, God himself that becomes a man. This is also the time in which the modern individual is born, not as some kind of expression of an undivided divinity, but some kind of replica of a division that already informs the original divinity, the original godly substance. We no longer have statues as the key art form of this period, but we have painting, and especially painted portrayals, as the epitome of an individuality that is no longer some kind of infinite spirituality that gets some kind of finite form, but rather an immediate expression of the self-division that informs the individual, the human subject, as well as the new modern divinity that dies on the cross. And most importantly, what changes in the modern Christian era is time itself, in the sense that time is no longer what it used to be in the classical era. In the classical era, we had something like a circular teleological time. Again, this is nothing new, but it's something that is always said when the difference between classic and modern are brought up. The classical Greek era was one in which time as circular/teleological was conceptualized, was theorized, and it was a time which, at the same time, there and not there, in the sense that every moment could not be pinpointed if not as something that would be separate from what preceded and followed. It's time and flow, time as flow, time as becoming. With the modern Christian era, another kind of time turns up, which is the Kantian time, the time that especially Kant conceptualized starting from the cogito, and it's time as the a form of experience, a form of sensory experience, essentially, the non-sensuous sensuous. And so we have, and this is again another reason why, in a way, for Malabou, painting takes over sculpture. We have something like the birth of the single moment alienated from the rest. We have a time that is now linear and no longer teleological and circular. And we have a time that is representational and logic and no longer chronologic, as it was the case for the earlier Greek time. I'm running a lot. I'm going in very fast, um, drawing in very broad brush strokes, something that Malabou takes pain to explain in dozens and dozens of pages, especially in the Future of Hegel, relying especially on on Derrida's own study of the conception of time in Hegel. And the key point, perhaps, here is to keep in mind that Derrida, when he talks about Hegel talking about Aristotle, the key point that he makes is that the key point that Derrida makes and that Malabou takes up is that when Hegel talks about Aristotle, quite strangely, talks about the Aristotelian time as Kant's eventual modern time was already somehow implied in it. So he kind of encapsulate the modern time as something that belonged already in some kind of implicit form in the classical Aristotelian time. Malabou does not always follow Derrida, but she does follows him here, as far as this is concerned. And her main point here is again that time changes, the nature of time, the nature that time has been conceived changes. Accordingly, plasticity changes as well. The way that plasticity informed subjectivity in the Greek time is not the way that plasticity informed the modern Christian time. What happened in between the two is something that, and again, this is one of the few times today that the third aspects of plasticity, namely the explosion of form, will turn up. What happened between the two is not something like a gradual evolution from one to the other. Of course, there is a component of that as well, as in all things, but it mostly happens through an explosion, namely an event that made the earlier classic plasticity explode, literally, namely it undid the articulations between the various components of the earlier conception of plasticity and triggered some kind of reconfiguration and recombination of the same elements in a different way in the eventual modern Christian plasticity. That event being essentially crucifixion and resurrection, as in the advent of Christianity as the event which made the earlier plasticity explode and be reconfigured in another one, in another kind. What we should consider now is, after having skimmed the surface of these two different times, of these two different plasticities, what we should remember now is when Malabou finishes her PhD thesis and publishes The Future of Hegel. Now, that time was the 90s, the mid 90s. And in the and we have to account for the context too, because Malabou is always very attuned to at least some of the main aspects informing the zeitgeist that she writes in. So context is always very important in Malabou. And that applies also to this earlier Hegelian phase of Malabou. It is not indifferent that she published this in the years in which the end of history, a la Francis Fukuyama, was still very popular, still widespread. So it was the time, like now it's different probably, but at the time, the idea of an end of history a la Francis Fukuyama was still a thing, definitely. And it's true that, and Fukuyama too, of course, is an Hegelian scholar, although he follows more kind of strand owing more to Alexander Kojève, which is not quite the kind of strand that Malabou follows, as she would also elaborate in a few essays, in a few further essays. Malabou, if implicitly, she kind of positions herself with the future of Hegel and the still widespread belief in something like an end of history in those days. And suffice it to recall the sentence with which the future of Hegel ends, which is: the philosophy of Hegel invites us to enter into the serenity and the peril of the someday of life. So there is something. So even if implicitly, it's not something that, like, Fukuyama is not a direct references of the future of Hegel or most of her works for that matter, but still it's there in one way or another. There is a positioning vis-a-vis that horizon that again in the 90s was still pretty strong. To make a very long story very short, her point is that the end of history a la Hegel should not be thought of as the end of anything new, in a sense. So if something like, so it can be admitted that something like an end of history has been reached, but then this does not mean that everything must follow some kind of preordained, predetermined track. So it's not that we have to kind of comply with some kind of deterministic mechanism according to which there is only one way that things can follow, and we only have to follow that track. There is not something like a predetermined deterministic path to go. That is not what the end of history really means, according to Malabou. The end of history is something like simply the revelation of the principle of subjectivity, which of course inform history with a capital H in a Hegelian in a Hegelian framework. And those principles would be the speculative unity between the two times, between the two plasticities that have informed the two phases that I sketched a few minutes ago. So the end of history is essentially the moment in which we can turn back and acknowledge the two faces of plasticity, which come down ultimately to the non-dialectizable sides of time, which are the chronological side of time and a representational, representative logic dimension of time. Essentially, ultimately, the end of history comes down to acknowledging that this is what subjectivity is like. Hence, by extension, this is what history cannot but be like. And this comes down to the acknowledgement of subjectivity as a structure of anticipation, namely, just as much as substance, in order to be what it is, has to go down into the accidents that at the same time are and are not herself, namely itself, namely substance. Subjectivity anticipate things in such a way that history will fulfill this expectation and not fulfill this expectation at the same time. In other words, it can be said that yes, the end of history is the acknowledgement that history can only follow the tracks of the particular structure of subjectivity that plasticity is ultimately. But this only means that we cannot foresee in advance the modalities, the ways, the shapes that this can take. Namely, we know the thing, but we don't know how the thing will metamorphose itself. And so the future exists. It's not that the future is entirely swallowed into some kind of deterministic preordained path. The future at the same time exists and doesn't exist, in the sense that it will be a surprise as much as something that we already know. So this is, in a nutshell, it. I'm taking just a couple of more minutes before I leave the floor to questions, just in order to skim the surface of the second essay, which, by the way, was published some 15 years or so after the PhD thesis by Malabou. And it is an essay in which Malabou makes particularly clear why her plasticity is not exactly coincident with Hegel's plasticity, although, of course, it's heavily derived from Hegel's system and Hegel's plasticity, there's still a difference between the two. And in a nutshell, the point is that she couldn't not take into account the fact that Derrida had come and had significantly criticized is not exactly the right word, but still had positioned itself in a certain way vis-a-vis Hegelian philosophy. So she does so by associating the Hegelian perspective, the Derrida's own perspective, and her own perspective, associating each of these perspectives with an animal. And the symbolic association with an animal would symbolize the way that would symbolize each of these three perspectives as each a different way of dealing with presence. Presence, again, philosophically, as the coincidence of something with itself, or more precisely, with its own concept. And more precisely, it each of these three animals symbolizes a way in which presence deals with its own negation. And so we have the Hegelian way, which is through the negative, after the negative, presence is restored. And it's again the familiar triadic pattern of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, which has been 1,000 times rightfully associated with Christian resurrection. So it's life, death, and the afterlife as the path of the concept. And that would be tantamount to a restoring of presence. Presence is there, is not there, and it's still there at the end after having gone through its negation. And the resurrection, of course, the animal of resurrection is the phoenix. The other animal, Derrida's animal, is the spider. Why? Because with the construction, we have the deferral, the indefinite deferral of presence. We have difference, so a delaying of presence, which is also the turning of presence into difference, that being kind of the textbook's definition of difference. So what we have is some kind of fabric. We have a tissue, we have a cobweb, we have a text. And indeed, when it comes to Derrida, presence is replaced by a system of differences that are articulated with one another in a textual manner. Malabou's plasticity comes under the aegis of the salamander as one of those animals that you can cut one limb off of them, but then this limb regrows in some different way. And the salamander would stand for a kind of plasticity which replaces textuality. It's no longer text as a tissue of differences that grow around a central scar which pushes presence further and further away. So it's no longer the text, it's no longer something textual, but it's a form. And in this form, presence is not exactly restored in the sense that presence comes back in the form of perhaps the artificial limb with which the limb that has been cut off is being replaced, but then that limb never quite looks like the original one. It's never a restoring of the original presence because the new thing is blatantly different. Difference is there within identity, with identity, along with identity, and the relationship between identity and difference is no longer one of subordination, like it was the case for the traditional Hegelian sublation, phoenix-like sublation of difference into identity. Here we have something that is not some kind of sound reconstruction of presence, but rather a regeneration of difference. That's the way that Malabou calls it. It's true that in Malabou, the various facets of plasticity, the one that has to do with philosophy, with epigenetics, feminism, etc., are very tightly connected with one another, but we'll try to deal with them in sequence. So yeah. And also I would encourage, if the possibilities there are all, answers not necessarily to come from me, but of course it would be very, very welcome if a question coming from the phone would be answered by another of you.
My question is, this kind of thinking is only related with organic subjects, not inorganic subjects. When we are talking about subjectivity as form, we are thinking on organic subjects only. And this is connected with my second question. Malabou defines plasticity as the act of giving forms, an action over something. What triggers this action? How can we reveal the forces of this organic subject?
The inorganic part comes with destructive plasticity, which is what we will see in the next few weeks mostly. Original triad of plasticity, namely to give form, to receive form, and to destroy form, is intended to be something like an actual unity between the organic and the inorganic, and the inorganic when push comes to shove. Or to put it in another way, and this is something that will recur quite frequently in the weeks that follow. It's like the destruction of form, which is also the principle in which the inorganic comes into play, uh, would enter the speculative interplay between giving and taking form in such a way that it comes across as some kind of non-transcendental condition of possibility for that interplay. Namely, the destruction of form is that which makes the interplay between giving and taking form possible from within, as in not from a separate transcendental position, but from one that still inheres inseparably the two main speculative poles of the plasticity matter. And so yeah, the shortest answer to your question is that the inorganic is the destructive plasticity part that has been relatively in the shadow in today's presentation, and that will be mostly, that will be more and more prominent in the weeks that follow. And the other question, the short answer to it is passivity, in the sense that of the various binaries that were quoted as speculatively identical in the last few minutes, the key one is that the key binary that circulates electrically from one pole to the other is activity and passivity. Plasticity is the actual unity between activity and passivity. So the answer to your question, I would say the source of action would be the source of action would be the passive reception of action.
I have quite some difficulty with this idea of reconstitution because there's never really a reconstitution of the identical. There is a transformation of the identical through difference. And I really think Malabou sometimes downplays the role of difference in Hegel. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts about this?
In terms of the essay that you quote, like the second essay of the readings for this week, there is a passage that kind of clarifies this point, and I think goes in the direction that you're indicating as well. Namely, you remember that, and it's something. Indeed, it's something that I had planned to mention, but I didn't. But it's very similar to what I said with regard to the other reading, when I mentioned Derrida's reading of Hegel, reading Aristotle as a reading of Aristotle in which the eventual subsequent conception of time that will only be introduced by Kant is already implicitly present. Now, what Malabou ultimately claims, I don't remember which page exactly I should go back to the text, but toward the end, there is some passage in which what she implies is that the plasticity that she comes up with, namely a plasticity in which difference is prominent, is not sublated to the fullest, is in fact already there in Hegel. So and this in fact describes pretty much the operation that she does vis-a-vis Hegel's philosophy the moment that it turns it on its head and makes plasticity into the center of it. In other words, the plasticity of the salamander that she conceptualizes is something that virtually was already there in Hegel as well. And it hasn't been highlighted in the texts of Hegel as much as it should have been, which again is a way of dealing with Hegel's original text that is not simply deconstructive, in the sense that again, I'm simplified, but would it be deconstructive? It would make Hegel say something that it didn't originally say. And what Malabou is saying is that, yeah, actually what he is originally saying is this relatively new conception of plasticity that I introduced, and that in fact you already hinted at both explicitly and implicitly, or let's say in a matter of proportion. So it's not that the reading differs from the reading of Hegel, from what Hegel says, from the conceptual dialectics of Hegel. What she says is that we have to give another weight to this component of Hegel's philosophy that was already there, but we perceived as marginal.
I have a question. The idea that the subject was before understood as individual, and now like the subject is not constituted by itself, but by a multiplicity of like other bodies because we're constituted multiple. That's the idea that you wanted to.
If it weren't also not one, it wouldn't be one, in the sense that there would be something that it would be missing. And if it's and if something is missing, it cannot be universal, essentially. So there must be, so in other words, there must be some kind of way in which the one enters into some kind of multiplicity, and the subject is the, let's say, trick of Hegel's to make the substance into something multiple. Because the subject is at the same time the substance and isn't. It is, as it were, the means whereby the substance becomes multiple.
It makes sense when she goes more like kind of like now more like into the idea of multiplicity and the tangibility of the body and yeah.
This I can mention already because it will be kind of central, probably particularly next week, in the next session. A lot of that is about not regarding multiplicity as something that contradicts unity. This is also something that he takes from Spinoza, that he's inspired by Spinoza with, except that, again, he claims that Spinoza wouldn't do it. And I can already invite you all to think of the salamander example as one in which identity and difference enter a relation which is not one of domination or not one of subordination. In the latest years, in the last few years, Malabou has insisted somewhat on the concept of anarchy as that which accounts for the ways in which unity and multiplicity enter some kind of, strange relationship that is, let's loose relationship with, is not one in which one dominates over the other. So, and indeed, it's true for both. So it's true also for the unity dimension, not only the multiplicity one. In the meantime, one thing that I can also mention that is kind of revealing of Malabou's overall attitude would be, like, one of the key claims in the future of Hegel is that Heidegger, like Hegel kind of anticipated Heidegger's criticism of Hegel and kind of overcame it already, as it were. So in other words, some kind of implicit response to Heidegger's critique of Hegel, even though critique is perhaps not the very brightest of ways to put it, can already be found within Hegel himself. And again, it is important to stress the fact that what Malabou tries to go out of, what Malabou tries to eschew, would be some very much French/Heideggerian way of reading Hegel. Or even more precisely, she wants to read Hegel along with Derrida in such a way that the whole Jean-Hippolyte Koyré-Kojève strand of French Hegelian philosophy is eschewed and avoided, as it were. So it is a way of overlapping Heidegger with Hegel that she does not quite buy into.
When we are dealing with the inorganic, so vitalism in the relationship with, for instance, when we think with agency it doesn't really work for her. What do you think about it? Yeah.
It seems to me that vitalism doesn't quite apply to her because it would imply something like an undivided one. So the idea of the very triad of the giving form, taking form, and exploding form is that of having division, or put differently, the negative, as something that is this side by side with the twofold component of the one, which is the giving form, and the receiving of form, in such a way that it comes across as some kind of non-transcendental condition of possibility. And vitalism lacks that. So vitalism implies someone in which the division is not there. And the destroying of form part is a way of making the division enter the equation in such a way that is the actual condition of possibility without being transcendental. And to me, I would say that according to her, in vitalism, division does not quite enter the equation as much as it should. In the meantime, like, there's not a lot of time left. That one thing that can already be introduced and that will be elaborated upon quite lengthily in the next few weeks will be, like, perhaps the key thing of plasticity that is also briefly introduced, like in a line or so, no more than a line or so, in the essay, in the first essay of the two essays in today's readings, is the distinction with flexibility, essentially. So what we'll focus the most probably in the next few weeks will be the distinction between plasticity and flexibility. Flexibility is some kind of indiscriminate capacity to receive form, some kind of limitless possibility to receive form, but plasticity is not limitless. Plasticity has limits. Again, it's limits that are inherent, because weren't they inherent, it would be too close to a transcendental scenario. But yeah, plasticity is not limitless. This is one thing that can already be sketched for further elaboration in the next few weeks.
So Marco, just to follow up that idea, that is interesting, this opposition between plasticity and flexibility, and to go back to the salamandra metaphor. I mean, because at some point she says that this metaphor can be associated with immortality. It's precisely, she questions the idea that this self-generation process can be infinitive, can be forever. She problematizes the possibility. That's the point.
She says that it can't. So the limits are still there, even in the transformative cells whose function can migrate from one limb to the other and from one function to the other. Those functions are not infinite. Like the functions of these stem cells that actually do the regeneration, the regeneration process, have the capacity to cover multiple functions, to perform multiple kinds of regeneration, but on an infinite number of generations. So yeah. So the limit is there in that sense as well.
And isn't the limit also on the body itself?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
definitely.
so it's not 100% flexible. So it's more plastic because it has a limit.
Yeah.
It's the same thing, yeah. And it's like the idea also of what happens in between that moment, like of explosion of a stem cell coming towards like moving to another thing.
Yeah, definitely. The body Malabou is not flexible. The body is
Yes.
plastic in the sense that it has
Plastic,
a flexibility. It has a limited flexibility, and in fact, we will see in week 3 or 4, that maybe 5, that there is a particular kind of contemporary subjectivity that is the new wounded kind of subjectivity that probably most of you have already know, and that kind of subjectivity, that is the subjectivity of those that are seriously neurologically ill to the point that their personality has been erased drastically, and all of a sudden, those are some kind of direct embodiment of those figures, those subjectivities embody the limit that defines the body and in fact the mind as well, literally. So yeah, and the explosion is not some kind of annihilation, but it's the condition for a different rearrangement of the same finite number of components to be reconfigured together. So yes. So yeah, the limit is key, as is the key to the fact that the limit is tangible. So in the sense that it's there and it's not transcendentally removed or intangible, but it's tangible. So yeah.
I think there's in page 86, she goes, today biologists use the concept of plasticity to refer to the ability of cells to modify their program, to change their text. So in a way, the limit would be the program,
Yeah.
the text. Yes.
Yeah, and program is another word that, as we will see, actually it is not among the key topics of these 6 weeks, but one of the things that Malabou has written the most in recent times has been epigenetics. So program here means something which, as it were, writes a certain development only retroactively, in the sense that it's a program which does not deterministically determine in advance a certain development, but is itself determined retroactively by the development that has followed it. So it is yet another way of conceiving of the saying plastic identities between activities and passivity in a non-deterministic way that ultimately plasticity is. Don't forget that the readings for one reading cannot be given, so the reading for ontology of the accident is something that needs to be gotten individually. Thank you very much for being here, and see you in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you.